Okay.
Okay, next slide, please.
Is it this one?
No, that's okay. Right, excellent. Here we go. So 2 years ago, 2018, we witnessed events commemorating the centenary anniversary of the representation of the People's Act, which gave the parliamentary vote to 8.5 million British women. And during that year, 2018, there were TV programmes, there were articles, lots and lots of focus, of course, on the daring and sometimes shocking deeds of the women who campaigned for equality. The stories are inspirational. The outcome, when finally achieved, justice at last for those who'd worked for over half a century to ensure that democracy included women. Now, there was an exhibition at Westminster. There was this new statue unveiled in Parliament Square of Dame Millicent Fawcett, who led the non-militant suffragists. And on the plinth of that statue, if you've seen it, are images of many less well-known women who worked in different capacities for the campaign for the vote. It was, all in all, 2018, a great year, and it put women's history and women's activism centre stage, reminding the world of women's strength. But what happened next? Might there be a danger that we go back to thinking that this was the high point of women's history? That after that, there's nothing more really to tell after that particular and very familiar struggle was won? Although, of course, we must remember that that struggle wasn't entirely won until 1928, when all women over 21 were granted the vote. Next slide, please, John. Now, if we did do that, it would be a big mistake, because the suffrage campaign was just one instance of women's activism and of their involvement in the transformation of public and political life. And although it's the suffrage campaign, images like this one that grab our attention, and we remember the fires, the bombs, the slashing of paintings, the acid in letterboxes, the horrors of force feeding, the result of hunger striking in prison. If we look beyond that, we see how very rich women's history is, and how much was and is achieved by women right here in our own city. People doing the most incredible things every day, giving of their time and their talents because they believe in what they're doing and believe that they can and must make a difference. And so it's some of those people, pioneers in fact, that I want to talk about this evening. Women who may not have a place in our national history books like some of the suffragist leaders, but who changed the face of politics in this city and beyond this city forever, just as other women did in other towns and cities throughout Britain. And in Coventry, the first women councillors were elected to the city just over 100 years ago in the autumn of 1919. And that really is as momentous an anniversary as 2018 and the granting of the vote. And it's one we shouldn't forget. And there are names that we ought to remember and to commemorate. Next slide, please, John.
Yes.
Actually, could leave it on that slide. That would be brilliant. Yep. Okay, thanks, Nicola. Okay, so basically, just to sum up after that, what I was really saying was that 2018 was the centenary of some women at least getting the vote, massive amount of media attention, lots of TV, lots of films, etc., etc. But there are other very important anniversaries, and one of those was certainly in Coventry when the first women became councillors in 1919. And we've been hearing, there's been quite a great debate really recently about the historic naming of streets and public places and the extent to which this does or doesn't reflect our history and our heritage. And there was, until a few years ago, a tradition in towns and cities of naming streets and local authority schools, municipal housing and public buildings after local councillors. But even this happens far less than it used to. And as the years pass, as the recent debate has shown, we walk past things without question. We either don't see them at all, or we don't know who the people are. We don't question why a tower block like this one is called Given's House. We don't know who Given's was. We don't know why a group of flats are called Corrie House, or a school. Perhaps we might know why a school is named Pearl Hyde. We might, but lots of people probably don't. And as for example, the paddling pool at Limbrick Wood School in memory of Ellen Hughes, or the park benches in Longford Park, recognising the community involvement of Jeannie Cant, well, these, I'm sure, are long gone, and their names and those of others are sadly largely forgotten by history. But these names, these were among our earliest women councillors. And although none had grand memorials or named buildings or paddling pools and etc., that these things symbolise hugely important work done to improve the lives of women citizens, of Coventry citizens, by securing decent housing, better schools, social services, and provision for nursery-aged children. Next slide, please, Nicola. In 1930s Manchester, Councillor Anna Mitchell campaigned for a new wash house to be built where families could get their washing done in a couple of hours, keeping the home free of wet clothes and steam. She knew its importance to women, not just to the order of the home, but to the health of their children. And she wrote later that it isn't a very romantic memorial. Every time I pass that little building, I feel that the women who helped to send me to the council have something tangible to remember me by. So in its way, such seemingly small achievements can make the biggest difference to people's lives. And that at least is part of what I want to remember today. And given how few plaques and statues and memorials, etc. there are around the country for women, surely it's all the more important to remember the work done, the sacrifices made by the first women councillors. Because, for one, they didn't have to do the work, and second, let's face it, no one goes into local politics for the glory. So, the pioneers. As the country adjusted to peacetime after the First World War, there was a great perceived need to focus on the next generation. And that meant ensuring more child welfare clinics, to nurture children by giving them decent surroundings, good housing, play areas, nursery education, and to offer women better maternity care. Next slide, please, Nicola. And above all, decent housing for families, which they so needed in order to thrive. All of these were only two uppermost in the minds of parents who had lost children to disease, poverty, and bad housing. A post-war climate of austerity meant that improvements, where and when they came, were patchy and slow. But women were poised to do whatever they could to push agendas and care for local communities. Not because men weren't interested, of course they were, but women had something else to give. Years and years of experience of being women, as workers, in the home, in the nursery, at the shops, in the markets. They knew, for example, how much things cost. And they were now poised to bring all this experience into local politics. Now, it may seem old-fashioned to us today to say that women's contribution to local politics focused on these so-called women's issues, and it certainly wasn't the whole picture, but these were the subjects that many women had expertise in, and they knew that that expertise was needed now more than ever because of the numbers of people living in unemployment due to living in poverty, due to unemployment, with disability after the war. living in inadequate housing and with poor social services. Men saw these things, but they didn't always, according to the women, pay close attention to the practical things that made the lives of families just a bit better, like, for example, wash houses. Next slide, please, Nicola. The first 2 women were elected in 1919 in Coventry, in the first local election held in the city since before the First World War. Alice Arnold, on the left of the picture, and Ellen Hughes were among some of the first in the country to take advantage of a new law passed in 1914, allowing women to stand if they had a simple 12-month residential qualification, rather than earlier property-based ones, which meant that some women could stand, but largely ruled out many married women and very many working class women. It's an interesting point, of course, that not only could some women stand for local government before the limited granting of the parliamentary vote in 1918, to women over 30 who met certain property qualifications, but also that women ratepayers could vote in local elections, and yet, despite that, they weren't given the parliamentary vote. Now, these are both facts that are pretty well hidden from history, and with them is largely hidden the picture of women with their huge amount of experience in local politics. Women were starting to take their rightful place on local councils. But before even this happened, there were already women poor law guardians, watching over the inhabitants of the workhouses, giving parish relief and support to those in need. They were serving on local school boards, and they were frequently asked to serve as ex officio members of committees, council committees, where men felt that a woman's touch was important. Usually those that dealt with female health, childbirth, hospitals, and other aspects of public health. Next slide, please. But even in these caring roles that didn't jar too much with Victorian notions of men as providers and women as nurturers and carers, women's presence was not always welcomed. In 1893, when a woman on the Workhouse Ladies Visiting Committee complained to a poor law guardian that the milk had turned sour for the residents, the master of the workhouse was clearly outraged, not just at their interference, but at the fact that they had bypassed his authority and taken their complaint to an elected guardian. So a large section of a meeting was given over to the matter, the master being at pains to say there was no problem. He'd simply substituted tea and sugar for milk until a fresh delivery the next day. And then he said, if the ladies stayed at home and looked after their own domestic affairs and left us to do the business of the board, we should all get on all right. And yet the reality was that there was a crying need for women to be associated with the workhouse, and particularly working class women who understood only too well the circumstances that had forced families there, and women who could try to do what they could to bring dignity and some comfort to the lives of those who were either temporarily down on their luck or likely to be ending their days there. The importance of fresh milk, for example, not substituting it with tea and sugar. Knickers for elderly inmates, where a master had ruled that these were just too expensive. Pillows, introduced by a Coventry woman guardian, in fact Emily Smith, who later became the city's second mayor during the Second World War, when she was appalled at their absence on an old people's ward. Just small comforts and things that women could make a difference with. Next slide, please. Oops. Okay, so we're just back to this one for a moment, just to make the point that these two women both, no, back one, please. That's it, lovely, thank you. These two women both sat on the Labour bench, which in 1919 was still a pretty small opposition, with 12 councillors out of 36, with a ruling coalition of Liberals and Conservatives. But both these two women already had a great deal of political experience, and although their life experiences were different, both championed working women and their families, and both believed that women must be present on local governing bodies to ensure that women's voices were heard. Despite their backgrounds, their welcome to the council might strike us today as rather patronising, with a few unfortunate turns of phrase likely to make us at least raise an eyebrow. "We are," said one male councillor, "moving in the line of tradition," and he hoped that the women would put into practice in municipal affairs the same spirit that guided a housewife in the control of a house. After all, he said, municipal administration was very little different to a wife's housekeeping. Now, I have little doubt that this was kindly meant and probably even intended to ensure that the new women would feel at home. Another said, in a phrase that raises a tighter smile, that he hoped that just as the mayor had succeeded in earning the goodwill of his fellow councillors, he would be equally successful with the ladies. So let's pause to hear a little bit more about these two women, Alice Arnold and Ellen Hughes. Their biographies remind us first that there is no such thing as typical when it comes to people's lives. And second, that whilst we might have our own notions of what a woman political pioneer looked like, lived like, etc., we are most probably wrong. For these two, and all those who followed, were typical Coventry working class women who just happened to know for certain that what they could offer was exactly what was needed to ensure that the woman's point of view was heard. Next slide, please. So here we have Alice Arnold, elected for Swanswell Ward, which doesn't exist, of course, now, but was bounded by Stony Stanton Road, by Primrose Hill Street, Harnell Lane East and Swan Lane. Elected in 1919, remained on the council as a councillor and then an alderman for the rest of her life. She was born herself in the Coventry workhouse in 1881, and her childhood was one of acute poverty and instability, growing up in some of the city's worst areas of housing. She was working by the age of 11, possibly attending school on a part-time basis, and she was working at Rudge Whitworth, the cycle manufacturers, when the First World War began in 1914. By this time, her political activism had begun, and she was a confirmed socialist and a committed trade unionist. She once, in fact, said that her heart and soul were with the labour movement, not housework then. The Workers' Union spotted her talent at supporting and organising women, and she was appointed as a full-time women's organiser in 1917. Can I have the next slide, please? Much loved by women war workers for her persistence in seeking fair, if very seldom equal pay for these workers, which was no mean feat when this was deliberately made as complicated as possible by government and by employers. In the munitions factories, men were generally employed to set up the machines that women workers operated. And so, by ensuring that the work that men and women did could not be regarded as exactly the same, pay differentials could be maintained. It's an old trick, and it's a trick that's continued. When worker Isabel McGee was taught by a helpful male inspector how to set up her own machine, it was Alice Arnold who helped her to make sure that as the first woman to be allowed to do this, she was paid the right rate for the job. Even then, this wasn't instantly forthcoming. Despite her skill, she was next told by a government official that she was still not entitled to be paid the men's rate because she was not grinding her own tools. Then, once she'd been taught to do this, she found she was still not earning what she'd been told to expect. This time, guess what? Because she wasn't old enough. With so many barriers, the young woman worker gratefully accepted the help of the committed trade union official who could provide her with all the necessary information to achieve a fair wage. She remembered Alice Arnold as a wonderful person for working women. It was her, really. She fought for the rate. Another worker remembered Alice's really down-to-earth speeches at the factory gate, spoken as a worker and as a citizen who understood the daily struggle of women's lives. She was like them. She knew their struggles because they were also her struggles. She was outspoken and direct, and, depending on your point of view, was either a breath of fresh air on a council dominated by male business owners or a pain in the proverbial, whose refusal to be intimidated by ceremony and tradition. We come to the next slide, we'll see that she always refused to wear her civic robes. This is in 1928. You can see Alice Arnold's on the right of the picture, almost just past the mayor to the right. She's still wearing her hat, refusing to wear her robes, as are some other councillors, just one or two. You can see somebody else on the right there, and they were from the Labour benches, who saw their civic robes as a barrier between them and the people they represented. But it ruffled more than a few feathers, and the press didn't like it either because they said it messed up the wonderful lines and the smartness of the occasion, but they stuck to it. By this time, we've got some other women on the council. It says on the top here, we've got Ellen Hughes, Emily Smith and Elsie Thompson, but Alice still not wearing her robes. Staying with Alice Arnold though, it has to be said that this direct, down-to-earth manner didn't always go down terribly well in the council chamber. And she was told at least once, after a particularly fiery, passionate speech, to remember that she wasn't at the factory gate now. Whether the same warning was issued to male trade unionists in the chamber, of which there are quite a few, is less clear. Combative she may have been, on the rebel side was how she was described, but there's no doubt she always had her constituents' backs. Here's just a few examples of her work, and all show how tough life was for Coventry citizens in the interwar years. These were years dominated by unemployment, by factory layoffs, by short-time working, and then, of course, the depression of the 1930s. So in 1919, just elected, Alice Arnold demanded that money be placed at the council's disposal from the National Relief Fund to feed unemployed people. Last Sunday, she said, hundreds in this city went without dinner, and they're not going to do it a second time. She said she was telling the council this not as a threat, but as a warning. And when relief was divided up into the different wards, her ward, Swanswell, where unemployment was very high following the closure of the ordnance factory in Red Lane, right in the middle of her ward, her own relief amount exceeded its maximum amount given out in the very first week. She said she'd been bombarded by applicants and simply could not and would not refuse relief to those in need. Nonetheless, the granting of relief was taken out of her hands. Next slide, please, Nicola. When the new council house, that's just a picture of the ordnance. Forgot about that one. Let's move on again. Thank you. Another wonderful Alice story. Because when the new council house was opened in 1920 by Prince Albert, the future George VI, she suggested that while he was there, the Prince might also see the other side of the picture and visit the filthy slums of the city. The mayor was very quick to inform her that this would not be part of the day's itinerary. But Alice was not just talk and bluster. On one occasion, she went with a tenant, a former First World War serviceman, who'd been evicted because of the alleged greed of his landlord. Alice stood quietly at the back of the court, But when she sensed that the magistrate wasn't listening, she lost her patience and declared, as she and the tenant left the court, that she was going to make such a stink of it in Coventry that it would shame the magistrates who'd heard the case. Her kindness, however, also had a gentler side, bringing, for example, bread, butter and eggs for a neighbour suffering from TB, offering his family childcare and making sure that the children had oranges, nuts and apples in their Christmas stocking. This was typical of stories that I was being told about Alice Arnold when I was researching her more than 20 years ago, when there were just a few people in the city who remembered her, often when they were children, but lovely stories like that. A colleague recalled, another slide please, Nicola, that there were 2 points that Alice always used to make in her speeches in those days, especially, this person said, if she could get an afternoon audience with a few fur coats in it. One was the instructions sent out to local authorities from the Minister of Health that baby food could no longer be given away at clinics, however poor the mother, but must be paid for at 3d a packet. The second was the row then going on between the medical officers of health and the ministry over starving school children. The medical officers said they ought to have power to order free meals before a poor child showed the actual symptoms of malnutrition. The ministry said, no, you shall only feed the child actually suffering from malnutrition. So these were some of the issues that she took on again and again. If we move on to the next slide, we can have a look at Ellen Hughes, also elected in 1919. There they are, her and Alice together. Ellen was perhaps a little easier for male councillors and for the press to warm to. Partly perhaps, I think, because she wasn't doing a job like a trade union organiser like Alice Arnold, which was usually associated with men. She was described in her campaigning leaflets as a married woman, whereas Alice Arnold was and remained single. But she also described herself, I think, as a housewife, and yet she was no more of a full-time housewife than was Alice Arnold. By the time she was elected, her 3 children were all of working age, and Mrs. Hughes was a fully fledged working class political activist, a member of the Cooperative Women's Guild, the Independent Labour Party, as well as having served on many public committees before and during the war. Ellen Hughes emphasised from the start the importance of bringing women of the right sort into politics. And by that she meant women who understood and knew precisely what it was like to be on the receiving end of public services provided by councils. Along with the importance of providing space and amenities, she wanted all houses to have baths. Next slide, please. Thank you. To deal with what she described as the incessant chasing away of dirt, she wanted women to have hot water heating in the new houses that were being built. But in order for this to happen, it would be necessary to improve Coventry's water, which was at that time so hard that it corroded the pipes in a very short space of time. Kitchens needed dressers, built-in cupboards, despite the fact that her male colleagues thought that the latter were an unnecessary expense. There must, she said, be space for children to play safely, away from the roads. And Councillor Hughes wanted to see estates provided with centres where children over the age of 2 could play, looked after by trained nurses. So her agenda, with its focus on families, housing, nursery education, may have made her appear a little less combative than Alice Arnold, but it still didn't protect her from some pretty blatant sexism from those who were very far from used to dealing with women in public life. After one speech in the council chamber, in which she stressed how difficult it was for young couples to start families in a city with such high levels of homelessness and jerry-building landlords charging extortionate rents for substandard houses, she was told by the mayor that there was no need for hysterics. Another time, A male councillor expressed his wish that Mrs. Hughes, "Oh, do wish she would be quiet, for she's chirping behind me like a little bird." Anyway, I just want to say thank goodness we can put such unenlightened views behind us. Oh no, hang on, wait a minute. Wasn't it a British Prime Minister who recently told a woman to calm down, dear, in the chamber? But anyway, today my focus is on these women's tenacity. What better tribute than the one read at Ellen Hughes's funeral in 1939, when the Reverend Richard Lee said what a mighty difference there would be in the world if they had 1 million women like Ellen Hughes. Despite their different backgrounds, there was much support and friendship between Alice and Ellen, and Alice chose Ellen as her mayoress when she became the city's first woman mayor in 1937. Now, this was an event that threw the papers into a right spin. First of all, what on earth to call the lady mayor? Here, the town clerk stepped in to emphasise that Madam Mayor was not acceptable and that she should be addressed either as Your Worship or the Right Worshipful the Mayor. Then there was the question of etiquette at social events. Organisers were all reminded that they needed to remember to provide 2 bouquets of flowers to prevent Miss Alice Arnold, as the civic head, being left out of the picture, so that the flowers didn't just go to the mayoress. Anyway, next slide, please. These 2 women had far more important things on their minds. Their commitment to erasing poverty and also to international peace was demonstrated here in this picture, which is them in London in October 1938, heading a procession, carrying a petition that was signed by 60,000 Coventrians, seeking lasting prosperity and an end to war. Coventry then was at the very heart of a move for peace and equality even before the Second World War, and the simple act of 2 women politicians placing a wreath at the cenotaph was a landmark feminist event that deserves to be remembered. Next slide, please. Before her term of office began, Alice Arnold, whose health was never good, made sure she had some rest and went off to Rhyl for 10 days, presumably to the Coventry and District Cooperative Camp. This was before the advent of Butlins, and facilities were basic to say the least. In 1932, there'd been promises of improved sanitary arrangements and lavatory conveniences for both sexes. 10 bell tents for families were being replaced with 10 large huts, alongside smaller huts, perhaps like this one, square tents and space for those who wished to pitch their own tents. The co-op referred to the camp, as you can see here, as Coventry by the Sea. Just perfect venue then for a woman who dedicated her whole life to the city. Such was her devotion that she actually, when she lost her job with her beloved union in 1931, it was because she refused a relocation to Birmingham in the year that she was due to become a Coventry alderman. Colleagues in the Labour movement valued her so much, despite their failure to ever stop her rebelliousness, that they set up a fund to buy her a greengrocer's shop in Lower Ford Street in Hillfields, so that she could continue to support herself and stay on the council. Because we have to remember that at this time, you needed council meetings were during the day, and if you didn't have your own income, which is why there were so many businessmen at that time on the council, it was very difficult unless you had an employer who would allow you to take time off work to go to the council. So they thought that if she had her own business after she was no longer with the union, that she could do that. But actually it wasn't right for her at all. She'd apparently just shut the shop up to go to council meetings and leave nobody in charge of it. And in fact, she ended her working life back as a co-op employee, an employer who did allow time off for council attendance. Alice Arnold and Ellen Hughes were described by long-serving councillor Sidney Stringer as bonny fighters. Alice Arnold served, as I said earlier, without break until her death in 1955. Ellen Hughes had a spell out of office, but was an alderman when she died in 1939. And by that year, 11 women had served or were serving, all on the Labour bench, all well known to each other through a network of Labour politics, trade unionism. Next slide, please, Nicola. The women's section of the Labour Party and the Women's Cooperative Guild. All of these were incredibly important all-female spaces in which thousands of women honed their political skills. Some years ago, former Labour MP Bill Wilson told me that he could remember the Labour women councillors far more than he could the men, possibly because of the extra work that they had to put in to be accepted and elected, but also, he reckoned, because of the strength of their characters. Next slide, please. This was also, I think, though, because of the reputation for very public, caring roles. Sarah Griffiths, in the wonderful hat, right in the middle of that picture, was a poor law guardian before the First World War, becoming a councillor in 1929 when the poor law was finally abolished and local authorities assumed the responsibility for those in the direst need. She was regularly presented with problems when she was out and about on the streets, and she would always stop and try whatever she could to help those in need. She was born in 1871, and her childhood, like Alice Arnold's, was spent in some of the poorest parts of the city and was working part-time as a child. She once told a reporter that having to work when she was so young probably helped her to understand other people's problems. But then she added, "I don't like talking about it now. It's all in the past." Next slide, please. Her public career was impressive. She, along with another woman councillor, Henrietta Givens, that takes me back to Givens House that I showed you earlier, was also one of Coventry's first women magistrates, elected in 1920. And it was somebody told me that if women were having domestic problems with their husbands, if they came to see Sally Griffiths for help, she used to tell them to make sure that the summons was issued on a Tuesday because that was the day she was on the bench. She received an OBE for the work that she did during the First World War on the local pensions committee and as a guardian. And Henrietta Hetty Givens, here on the left, had also been a trade union organiser during the First World War and in the immediate post-war years. Had also worked alongside Alice Arnold to ensure that women who were leaving factory work and after the war and going back into hugely unpopular domestic service remained, if they could, unionised and didn't just disappear back into the isolation, loneliness and low pay of service. So these were women who knew the stuff of other women's lives. Next slide, please. Emily Smith, we have here, became Coventry's second woman mayor in 1942. She came to Coventry from Bradford in 1915 and was widowed 4 years later. She brought up her children alone and also her granddaughter after the death of her daughter-in-law. The Midland Daily Telegraph praised the mayor's industriousness, noting that she even found time to do her own shopping, leaving her bag and ration books at the shop and collecting her order when it was made up for her. And as she came to the end of an exceedingly challenging mayoral year in 1942, she concluded that all I wanted to be was a good mother to the citizens. Now, whatever their political experience, all the women who served on the council were skilled, tenacious and bold. It isn't easy to call things out when they knew that it would be unpopular. Until 1937, Labour was the opposition party, and the ruling coalition resented implications that they were unsympathetic to the needs of Coventrians. When an alderman referred to the work of child welfare clinics as state interference, Alice Arnold was straight in there, telling him that they provided invaluable help to the working man's wife, who had to be cook, housekeeper, nurse, sewing maid and charwoman. How would he and his colleagues know this, she said. Many of them still had servants and their wives were not expected to take on all these roles. There was a huge amount of indignation at her remarks. She didn't care, she was going to say it anyway. Next slide, please. Because these were the women who handed on the torch to others. Pearl Hyde, right in the middle of this picture. Much loved leader of the Women's Voluntary Service in Coventry during the Second World War, became Coventry's first woman Lord Mayor in 1957, having herself been encouraged into politics by Emily Smith during the 1930s. So, those are the pioneers. Today, Coventry has 19 women councillors, making up around 35% of the council. This year, as last year, we have a woman Lord Mayor. This year it is Anne Lucas. This then is all pretty good. It's just that percentage, 35%, is about a percentage higher than the number of women at Westminster, for example. But are we happy to leave things as they are? Are we all right with anything less than gender parity? Can we have the next slide, please? When just, so these are just the pioneers. We have the next slide, please. I'll come back to that slide in a moment, but so these are our current 19 women councillors. When just 11 women in 100 years have been mayor, can we take this as a sign that equality has been reached? The Fawcett Society last year revealed that across England, 35% of women were councillors. 96% of councils were male dominated, and that women were outnumbered 3-to-1 on 12% of councils. So there's plenty to think about there. Let's kind of just go back to show the slide. We just go back one to these, the 11 before 1939. Names I think that we should remember, names that I would like to see commemorated in the city somehow. The talk today has been to commemorate, to celebrate these pioneers who took on the work, but they also remind us of the sacrifices, great service that all councillors give to their communities. And we don't tend to remember councillors from any part of the country. It's fitting then that we end with a quote from Alice Arnold. Present at the 600th anniversary of the granting of Coventry's charter in 1945, she stood up in St Mary's Hall and she said this: "I can say, on behalf of the women of Coventry, that they desire to serve their city to the utmost of their power, side by side with the men. The great interest which the women of today take in city affairs, shown not only by their seeking membership of public bodies, but in many other ways, is very appropriate in a city which has owed so much to women. I expect that if some of the women of the past who I've mentioned were today able to be present in this hall, which many of them knew so well, they would be surprised to see a woman alderman on this platform taking part in a meeting of the City Council. But I think they would approve it." And there it is right there, a city which has owed so much to women. And as for Coventry, so it is for the rest of the country. So let's remember those women pioneers of councils up and down the country. Thank you very much.
That was fantastic, Cathy. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nicola. I think that puts you in charge of questions now.
So, Nicola, you need to close the
I was going to hand over
share.
Okay.
Hi, Cathy. Can I ask you a question?
Yes, you can, Ben.
What? I know you're living in Coventry now.
Yeah.
You're not a natural born Coventrian. You've been kind of naturalised, as it were. Was it purely your location that made you want to delve into women councillors in Coventry, or was Coventry some kind of a? Did they lead the way in any way, or?
You know, the first part of your question is a really interesting one, Vin, because I sometimes think that the way that I went at the time when I was researching women councillors, I had quite young children of my own. So I was very keen to find out what was going on my doorstep, partly because I was using those services, partly because I didn't have the freedom to move all over the country. And as I began to do that, I began to realise that that was the same for quite a lot of the women councillors that I was researching at the time. Now, whether they would or wouldn't have gone on to become MPs or taken on national roles, I don't know. But I think that many of them worked within the area in which they lived, had experience of, wanted to know more about, much in the same way as that's how I started my historical research. So that's the first part of that question. In terms of, was it different here? No, I don't think it was. I mean, I think Coventry is a brilliant example of a working class city. Didn't have a Labour control until 1937, later than some. Makes it perhaps, but you know, it's an industrial working class city. But no, not really. I do think that, you know, there needs to be research done on women councillors all over the country, because, and not just women, I do think, you know, men and women councillors, because this is the stuff of politics. This is not necessarily the glamorous part of politics, but it's our everyday experience of politics. It's like true politics, if you like. You know, we can't step out of our front doors without experiencing the services that are provided for us by our local councils. And that's, I think, why that's important.
Thank you, Cathy. Next question.
Peter Waters. You need to unmute yourself, Peter.
Hi, Cathy.
Hello, Pete.
All right. Great
Yeah.
talk. Yeah, I mean, 100 years on from the events you started off describing, we live in quite a different kind of city, in a sense, much more diverse in many ways.
Yes.
And of course, there are a number of Asian women who are now councillors, aren't they, from the Asian communities? I wonder if there are ways you think we ought to be encouraging women from other communities, other new communities in the city, to get involved in politics and perhaps aim for the city council. As you say, you know, it's the stuff of politics, and although it's not glamorous, as Parliament might still be regarded as glamorous, it's very, very important at grass level, isn't it? Grassroots level.
It is, and all those things that we saw, all those organisations that I mentioned 100 years ago that were giving women confidence to speak, not necessarily all female organisations, but I think they helped. Joining things like, you know, at the time, things like the Cooperative Women's Guild, women's sections in Labour parties, they do all give women the opportunity to learn public speaking, to speak out, to be confident without being intimidated by a bigger meeting where some voices are larger and louder than others. So of course definitely we should be getting women, trying to encourage women, because it's women who are on the front line of all local services. It's women who suffer most when there are cuts to those services, and it's women who can lead the way to make those services the best they can be. Just like Ellen Hughes saying, you know, it seems so obvious to us that houses needed baths. Well, you know, the men might have been more interested in cost cutting, or not even thinking about the consequences. They want to, you know, just bypass things like that, whereas women are right on it. She understood the need for safe play areas for children. it stands to reason, but sometimes these things get lost, I think, in wider debate. So it's it's not. I'm not saying that women only go into politics on issues that affect women. They don't, because they're there to represent everybody. But I think that's how it started, and that is still a very important voice.
Paul, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, what I wanted to ask is that next year's City of Culture, and I know that they're floundering about to sort of come up with ideas for public art and what they call signposting and wayfaring. I was just thinking that because Alice Arnold is such an important first mayor, and Coventry Society likes putting plaques around the city, I just wondered if there's any location that would really sort of suit. I know that she was born in Whitefriars workhouse, but even Whitefriars hasn't even got a plaque on it to say what Whitefriars is. So, sort of, and she lived in various locations, Short Street and places like that. But then I was thinking about your list of all the councillors, there ought to be more sort of informative plaques and public art and things like that. And it's one of the things that always gets left out of when they're looking at something, they always look at the, famous industrialists,
Exactly.
They never really look at the grassroots. And I just wondered, one, where would you put a plaque and where would be appropriate for Alice? And also any suggestions of sort of, just letting people know exactly what has happened in the past and the importance of trade unionism and the women's movement.
I completely agree, Paul, and I think, like you say, these are people who made massive contribution. All councillors make a massive contribution to the city, and it's mostly goes unsung. I don't know. I mean, yeah, Alice lived in various places across the city. She was always on the move. And there are various, Short Street might be somewhere but I think it should be somewhere within the city centre, and I'd like to see a plaque to all of them. Somewhere maybe on the outside of the council house. Let's have it, let's have it big, and let's have it so that, that with information about these women as well, not just first women, but perhaps, a good list of those who made that difference. Don't know where else it should be. What does anyone else think? Anyone else?
Maybe somewhere in the Guildhall.
Possibly Guildhall, because that's a good idea. But I'd like to see it outside as well, rather than having, because people don't always go in. Thank you. People don't always disappear into buildings, do they? It's it's nice to think about something as you're walking past.
What about some sort of artwork to remember women in engineering, for instance? I've not seen it, but I understand that in Sheffield there's been quite a big project done in the last sort of 10 years called Women in Steel, which actually took five women who'd worked in the steel industry going way back, and built a whole thing around that. I mean, surely we've got the same in terms of engineering. I mean, you mentioned that Alice herself worked for Rudge was it? And many of the women of this city have worked at various times for the big engineering companies. Perhaps we ought to have some kind of women of engineering or something. I don't know, some kind of public, not necessarily a statue or a sculpture, but something.
It can't just be one. I agree, Pete, but we have to make sure that all the different roles are represented and that things aren't pulled together. So yes, definitely we should have something to do with engineering, but we should also still have something about politics. And Paul, I think also what you say about trade unionism, absolutely, definitely we should have something on. I don't know where yes, possibly the Guildhall, but it's just got to be somewhere that people will see it. And I think we need to talk to the council about this. They've got those wonderful portraits as you go up the stairs in the council house, but again, you have to go inside and you have to look at those, and you have to, sometimes it's a bit intimidating depending on the reasons why you're in the council house as to whether you're even going to look at those. So somewhere
I feel an agenda item for our next meeting, Cathy.
Yes, and think also about Hannah Mitchell, and you know the fact that she said, you know, I like to think of that little bathhouse as a memorial to the work that I did, and perhaps it's on, I don't know, it's, you know, it's on a facility that children are using, that is really important to the city's children, and that we think back to what these women were asking for in terms of children's safety and well-being, women's, you know, antenatal care, maternal care, and it's something around those.
Do we have another question? Sabine.
Yeah, hello. Hello, my name is Sabine. I'm joining a Coventry Society for the first time in many years again. So I'm really pleased to be here. I just wanted to say also thank you for an interesting talk, but I'm not sure whether you are aware that the new Arts and Humanities building, or the refurbished building complex, which will come out of former Graham Sutherland and Maurice Foss and Bugatti building, will be named after a woman in Coventry who made quite a big impact in Coventry. And Alice Arnold was actually on the shortlist.
Oh, was she? Good.
Yeah, but I think it's going to be Delia Derbyshire now. But it is quite interesting because there was a real aim to move away from the all male dominated naming of the buildings in the faculty. And I'm not sure whether we should not diminish the work, you know, of artists and designers, male artists and designers. But I just wanted to say that this will be the new name for the. Oh,
that's good. That's good. That's good. I'm pleased and I'm glad that. I hope that Alice gets maybe put on a shortlist. Are they renaming all buildings, or is this just because there's a new building?
Well, this is because there's a refurbishment of this building complex, which will include a new building, as it were, a new part of the building.
Right.
And so, yeah, Alice Arnold was on the list, Cara Bray, and Delia Derbyshire, the three women. There was another man as well. But yeah, I think it's quite interesting and quite exciting.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I also wanted to ask you something to the previous question. Do you think it's not just down to whether people or women feel confident to speak up in politics, but the hugely hostile environment we are in now? I mean, I'm speaking to young women, students, other young women I know, and they say we absolutely don't want to go into politics because the way we are treated online, you know, the online trolling is so toxic.
Yes,
Many women say we don't want to be in this environment.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think it must have been tough enough in 1919 to have to deal with the local press who were, you know, unsure about the way to go and would, you know, perhaps get it wrong, and there'd be the odd angry letter from somebody who wasn't quite sure that women deserve their place in local politics, but nothing compared to the toxicity that we have on Twitter and social media generally. I agree with you. It is enough to put anybody on. It's absolutely vile. And so you're right. Is confidence enough? Support networks help. You know, knowing that you're not on your own, knowing that there are people who can get you through that, who have your back, who know your self-worth, who help you through all that, you know. But we shouldn't, I mean, we should, yes, okay, so we should have those things anyway, but it's outrageous that we need, that you need to have, to even think, gosh, could I handle that? Could I handle that amount of abuse online? It's just horrific. So yeah, I agree with you entirely.
Thank you.
Do we have another question? No. If not, we'll go on to Vince to sum up what the Society's been doing over the last few weeks.
Well, if Cathy can't tell us when her next book's coming out, I'll move on.
Not just yet, Finn, not just yet. Thank you.
Cheers. Well, thank you very much, Cathy. All your talks are inspirational and extraordinarily well attended. So you're gaining quite a reputation in this area. Thank you very much for talking to us tonight.
Thank you, thank you. I'll say goodbye and let you get on with your meeting.
Thank you very much.
Right, thank you. Bye.
Yes, thank you very much, Cathy. Thank you.
Bye-bye.